in school.
Oh boy. It's nice to see all you fine people. Greet the person next to you if you don't know them. Take a moment and do that. If you already know them, tell them how good they look today. True or not? I was going to say iPad. I'll take that. I tucked it way back in there. Man, it's like my heart. I go through so much during a Sunday morning that, by the time you get up here to preach, it's just a difficult transition. If you've ever tried to preach on a Sunday morning, it can be kind of difficult just to get started. So God help me as I do this. But just hear me out for the time I'm up here, because the truth is this: you might hear something that could change your life forever, from the heart of God to your heart. I can't guarantee that's going to happen to you today. It might. I hope it does. But how many of you believe that you can hear something from the Lord through His Word that can go into your heart and literally change your life, change your being from the inside out? I heard something from the Lord during worship. It spoke to me personally. It just changed me forever, The goodness of God. I don't know about you, but in the worship service, just the goodness of God, I was just being overwhelmed. If you showed me a picture of my life right now, 5 years ago, especially like 10 years ago, I would not believe it. I would not believe it. I've been thinking about that lately. So I want to share with you just 4 scriptures today from John chapter 15. The Gospel of John, I love so much. One teacher that I had at Zion said this about the Gospel of John, and I think it's so true. He read this quote somewhere. He said, the Gospel of John is like this body of water that's so shallow that a child would never be able to drown in it, but it's so deep that an elephant could swim in it. You know what I'm saying? When people first get saved, sometimes you give them the Gospel of John. Here, read this. Because the big question that's asked in John is, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? But the depth of spiritual truth that's in the Gospel of John, it just goes on forever. I mean, you could just ponder some of these things forever. So here's the deal. Jesus and his disciples. Jesus is on his way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And with his disciples, and they've already finished the Last Supper. This is the very end of Jesus' life, very end of Jesus' ministry. And John chapter 15 is part of this unit that we would call, that some people call the Farewell Discourse. It's like Jesus' farewell to his disciples. He has a lot to say to them before he goes to the cross. A lot of things they're not really understanding, and I think for good reason. But he's talking to them a lot, mostly about the coming of the Holy Spirit. He keeps saying, listen, I'm leaving here. I'm going to return to the Father. But it's imperative, it's so important that I go. Because when I go, I'm going to actually send my Spirit, and the Spirit is going to dwell in you. I can't be with all of you guys all the time, everywhere you go. There's just not enough time for that. So I'm going to go to the cross, give my life as a sacrifice for sin, be buried, resurrected, ascend to the Father, and give you my life-giving Spirit. And these words were supposed to really comfort the hearts of the disciples. So chapter 15, it's about the coming of the Holy Spirit, and it's about the importance of being really united with Jesus, And in chapter 15, I want to talk to you today about the vine allegory, okay? Just 4 verses. Verse 1, Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. It says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. This is the last of these. Jesus gives these 7 I am sayings throughout the Gospel of John. These I am sayings reveal a lot about Jesus' character and who he is and what he came here to do. He said, I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I am the door. Remember, he said, I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I mean, who else has made that claim about himself other than Jesus? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And lastly, he says, I am the true vine. So I started reading a little bit about what you would call viticulture, the science of growing grapes. And viniculture is the science of making wine from grapes. And I'm reading through an encyclopedia, and let me just share with you for a minute about this, because I think it's important. When Jesus told his disciples, listen, I am the true vine. I mean, what does that mean? So vineyards were really common in Palestine. Okay, in Palestine, it's a real mountainous country. People lived in the hills, and there were a lot of vineyards along these slopes of the hills. And Palestine was a great atmosphere for growing grapes. There's plenty of sunshine. In Canaan, the promised land, the vineyards were incredibly fruitful. Remember when Moses sent out those 12 spies to scope out the land, and they took this vine that was so huge, they tied it to a stick, and two of them carried this vine back to him, saying, listen, the land God's bringing to us is really awesome. Okay, so it's a fruitful land. Vineyards thrive in these peaceful conditions only because these vines need constant pruning of the branches in order for the grapes to become really mature. Not only were grapes produced, but wine and raisins as well. Also grape honey I was reading about. You know, when God said, I'm going to bring you to a land flowing with milk and honey. You know, I think part of that could be from these grapes made into prunes and boiled into this like molasses type material. Could be a byproduct of it. I'm sure there were also actual honey from bees, but so fruitful vineyards were really a sign of God's blessing. You know, to the Jewish person at that time when Jesus spoke this word and he said, I am the true vine, a fruitful vineyard really was a symbolic of God's favor and blessing. Jesus says, I am the true vine. To his disciples, the vine was this symbol of Israel. Isaiah describes Israel as this choice vine that God had plucked out of Egypt and had planted in this fertile soil in the promised land. This vine took deep root and filled the land with blessing, right? God's people now dwelling in the land of promise and God's blessing flowing through them. God's people were supposed to be a light for the rest of the world. They're supposed to give testimony to God. But listen to this. Even though God provided these perfect conditions for this so-called vine, the people of Israel, to be fruitful in, they still ended up chasing after other gods, the gods that their surrounding neighbors worshipped. And Isaiah says they've become a wild vine. How many have become like that at some time in your life? I've become this wild vine. I mean, I believe that God has given me, maybe God's made himself really available to you and given you so many different kinds of opportunities. And you've just never responded to him. And what Jen was saying during worship was that all that God's really ever wanted was a response to him. All that God has ever really wanted was our hearts. All he wanted from the Israelites at that point was for them to live a life loving God and being obedient to him. And he said, everything's going to go well with you if you do that. So by saying, I am the true vine, Jesus is really saying that he's claiming to be the replacement of Israel. Jesus is saying all of God's intentions for Israel to be this obedient people to the will of God and be a blessing to the world are fulfilled in me. That's a pretty heavy claim. So Jesus is the replacement of Israel, if that makes sense. Israel used to be, as you read in the Old Testament, this channel that God flowed through to bless the entire world. You know, started with the promise to Abraham. Listen, I'm going to bless you and your descendants. All the families of the entire earth are going to be blessed through you, through your coming king. So at this point in history, this blessing is now flowing through Jesus and his followers. That's you and I. We're the people of God. We're the new people of God. You know, the New Testament teaches you don't have to become Jewish in order to love God and follow God. You need to believe in Jesus. Jesus is the new Israel. Jesus is now the one that's invited the entire world to believe in him and be part of this new, covenant community people. I hope that makes sense. So we're the people of God. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser or gardener. We said that the constant pruning of these branches were necessary for these grapes to reach maturity. Jesus said, I'm the true vine. I'm like the replacement of Israel. I'm really where it's at. God's blessing is going to flow through me. And my Father is the gardener. He prunes back the branches. Verse 2, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. I used to be afraid of this verse. I read this verse. A couple verses after that are the ones that I really used to be afraid of. This is what I used to be afraid of. If anyone does not abide in me, Jesus said, he's cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. Holy cow. I mean, I saw that at Calvary up on the screen, after I first saved and